So hello again. In this next module I want to change tack a little bit and look at the ways that creativity has shown itself throughout history. First though, I want to demonstrate that creativity has been with us since the dawn of mankind. Now this old chap doesn't look in such great shape right now, but 5,300 years ago he was looking a little better. His demise was not, of course, well documented, but he appeared to be out exploring on his own. He was shot with a flint-tipped arrow and so could have bled to death, although hypothermia could also have got there first. He's known as Iceman, and that's because he was actually buried by glacial action. I mean, he was frozen in a block of ice and discovered by a hiker a decade or so ago. Now, why is of interest to us is that the arrowhead that was buried in his shoulder is clear evidence of creativity. But also he was carrying a woven kind of burlap bag which contained cultivated grains. I have no idea quite how they can be sure of that, but there are certain characteristics of cultivated crop grains that are a little bit different to the wild varieties. Now, maybe he took the grains with him as sustenance on his hike, or maybe he was looking for somewhere fertile to plant them. But the fact that the grains were cultivated is evidence of creativity in the domain of agriculture. In very early times, hunter-gatherers just picked fruit and other plant products, and maybe also ate small animals from time to time. But as the tribal size grows, so does the distance you need to travel in order to gather your food for the sustenance of the tribe. That, of course, is the driving force behind corralling of animals and cultivating crops in fields. So they can be relatively close to you and you can put your feet up and be watching football on a Sunday instead of actually gathering food. Now, when I lived in Las Vegas, I used to take my trailer up to an area called Valley of Fire, which is a quite magnificent national park with many large outcroppings of red rock of considerable height, and you can camp in the valleys and crevices between them. It's really very beautiful. These rock slabs have moved over time, and they have in fact sort of sheared one to the other as the Earth's crust has moved around in those areas, and they've created enormous heat. Because although it's a very, very slow movement, the pressure is so great that the heat produced is still phenomenally large. Enough heat, in fact, to scorch the surface of the rock. Now, as you may have guessed, my childhood was spent on the other side of the Atlantic, in England, in fact. And while you were watching colour TV, we were sewing animal skins together and living in the trees. But one thing we did have to entertain ourselves, and we were a simple people, was called scraper board. Now, I don't know if it travelled over here or not. It comprised a black board with a white plaster-like surface on it, or the other way around, a white board with a black surface. And if you use a sharp instrument to scrape away the surface, the colour below is revealed. Looks a little bit like an etching. This is the same kind of effect as the blackened surface of the rocks at Valley of Fire. So imagine the excitement of our ancestors as they found they could scrape away the blackened surface of the rock to reveal the red underneath. And this is an example of the kinds of things that they created. Now, some anthropologists look at this evidence and they like to suggest that these petroglyphs are maps to tell others where the buffalo roam, where the water is, and information like that. But I really question that. The creators of these images were nomads. They'd visit the valley from time to time and then move on. And as they moved on, other tribes would come in to occupy the valley. And this was generally thought to be something that was related to the seasons of the year. Now, I question why you would give away valuable information regarding resources to your competition. I mean, in later years, in the days of Christopher Columbus and so forth, Maps were some of the most protected of all intellectual property. Now, I suggest that these images could have simply been expressions of fun, creativity for its own sake. Now, if we move on in time, there are several periods when creativity has really blossomed. Now, we don't think of China nowadays as being one of the most creative countries in the world, not least of which is because many of the inventions that we experience today have come out not from the East, but from the West. However, if we wind the clock back, China had invented paper by 50 AD and a seismograph for detecting vibrations in the soil, oncoming earthquakes, for instance. They had movable type printing by about 1000 AD, along with gunpowder at about the same time, which they didn't, by the way, use for war. They used it for fun, for fireworks. At the same time, Chinese ships often had compasses, and the mechanical clock was also invented some 200 years earlier than in Europe, and the list goes on and on. If we move on to around 1300 to the 1600s in Italy, we have another era of extraordinary innovation in the form of the Renaissance. The earliest design of the submarine was created by Leonardo da Vinci. However, Cornelius van Drebbel, who was one very successful creator of mechanical objects, he was the one who successfully developed the submarine in 1624. It was actually tested on the River Thames and remained submerged underwater for about 3 hours. Now, the Thames isn't terribly deep, so this was not, by today's standards, an incredible achievement, but just imagine at that time being able to be underwater for 3 hours. Mechanical clocks were introduced during the Renaissance in the 14th century. The earliest designs used a drum of mercury that were turned by weights, and in around 1650s, a pendulum clock was made by the Dutch guy Christian Huygens. He improved the clock to reduce the error to 10 seconds a day. Now, if you think about going from no timekeeping method other than the sun, which frankly in England is not the most useful of things, or in Holland for that matter, that's probably why they invented the clock. However, the sundial got pretty sophisticated, and if you have sun, was a pretty good way to measure the time. But without the sun, basically you're out of luck. So the clock was pretty important. And imagine going from no clock to something that was basically accurate to 10 seconds a day is quite an astounding achievement in a short time. The clock, by the way, was absolutely critical to accurate navigation on the oceans. We could measure the latitude because of the angles of the sun. What we can't measure is where we are around the Earth's surface in terms of longitude, and that's really where the clock comes in. If we just move on for a few seconds, the printing press in the West was invented by Johann Gutenberg in Germany in about 1440. As in China, woodblock technology was used for printing prior to this. The technique used by Gutenberg became known as letterpress printing. Now, if you imagine, it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that in China we had movable type printing, many hundreds of years before this, and yet it didn't creep around the world to Europe. We have things like eyeglasses that were invented, created in Italy in sort of 1284, somewhere around there it's thought of. And if we move a little bit further on towards the current time, and we look at England, this was the birthplace of what we now call the Industrial Revolution, during which time literally hundreds of inventions created the foundation of the current industrial world. A few of these. The spinning jenny was a very important addition to fabric manufacture. It was invented in 1764 by a guy called James Hargreaves. It could be operated by unskilled workers. Previously, weaving cloth was quite a skilled activity and very slow, often done by crofters, in other words, people living in hovels in the middle of the countryside. And when factories, the idea of factories, we have more people generating more stuff. So you needed to innovate in some way if you're actually going to speed up the process, and the spinning jenny was important for that. It was a key development in the industrialization of weaving. You could also spin many spindles at the same time, so you weren't stuck with a kind of Henry Ford cloth, you know, sort of black is the only color you can get kind of thing. So you could actually start to jolly things up a little bit. Around the same time, and just a little bit before that, in 1712, Thomas Newcomen invented the first steam engine. It was used predominantly for coal mining to pump water out from the mines, so that miners could dig a little bit further down. The engine used coal, not unreasonably, to create steam, which operated the steam pump. It was dreadfully inefficient and required huge amounts of coal to get a relatively small amount of water out of the mines, but nonetheless it was a steam engine. If you go up to the early 1800s, around 1812, the first recorded steam railway journey took place. A locomotive carrying, once again, tons of in this case, iron, 5 wagons and 70 people, and it achieved the record-breaking speed of 9.75 miles in 4 hours and 5 minutes, average speed of 2.5 miles an hour. However, it was only 25 years later that Stephenson and George and his son Robert designed what's called Stephenson's rocket, and that was the most advanced locomotive of its day. It's had a smoke chimney at the front and a separate firebox at the rear. Became the template for steam locomotives for the next 150 years. 150 years that design was basically what everything else was based on in locomotion. In the 1830s, you had Cook and Wheatstone, who demonstrated the first electrical telegraph. Now, once again, you know, we look back at these things and it's kind of a bit sort of, oh. But if you imagine that the ability to communicate information from anything further than just your buddy a few feet away that you were talking to, you know, was virtually impossible until moving type created mass printing, and you started to have things like the newspaper industry, and then sort of instant communication in the form, first of all, of telecommunication using Morse code. I mean, pretty basic stuff, but nonetheless, to be able to send information for all intents and purposes immediately across a country as large as America. Indeed, in 1844, telegraph wires connected Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Not exactly all the way across the country, but quite an achievement. So, you know, this stuff at the time was really incredibly important, and led the way, of course, to lots of other creations, innovations, to lead into the industrial world. And around this time, we had the photograph being invented, a rather complex and messy device that was sort of the prototype for the modern typewriter. Well, there isn't such a thing as a modern typewriter, but you know, you understand what I'm saying. We also had dynamite around this time being invented, the generator for electrical energy, and basically the prototype for the modern factory. Now, let's have a look at this in the context of the kind of theoretical stuff that we've been studying in terms of creativity. On the one hand, you have my group affiliation model, which suggests that people are most likely to generate novel ideas when their individuality is salient. Okay, I just want to remind you of this. So on the one side, you have the human need for connectivity with people. We want to be in groups. And on the other side, you have our need for individuality. We need to be and seem to be unique. So when we're in a group, it's our similarity to others that's on our mind. And when we're on our own, it's our individuality that's important to us. And essentially, individuality means difference from others. Now, when we look at these periods of extreme innovation, the fact that they occur in localized areas, in other words, you had this extraordinary inventive period in China, you had the Renaissance essentially coming from Italy, you had the Industrial Revolution coming from the UK. In our contemporary world, you know, an awful lot of the things that we use on a day-to-day basis, from the iPhone to, you know, the laptop, tablet, iPad, high-speed internet, an awful lot of that is coming from Europe or North America, and a lot of it from North America, partly because of the size of the marketplace, but also because you have got, once again, pockets of innovation. I mean, we talk about the world of computer and electronics and so forth, and we think instantly about Silicon Valley. I mean, Silicon Valley, you know, it was called Silicon Valley because it was the hub of the integrated circuit industry and all the other things that have made iPhones and iPads possible. So if we have a look at, I mean, for instance, the evidence for extreme creativity in painting, sculpture, music, and similar areas. So Renaissance was not just about technological innovation by any means. In fact, it's known much more in some ways for its cultural innovation. So it's kind of interesting that these things happen in concentrated geographical locations, because, you know, as I say, the group affiliation model would suggest that groupiness would tend to reduce our motivation to be creative. So what's this all about? And anyway, why do these things sort of come and go? Why do we get this huge bubble of Chinese innovation and then that dissipates? Well, in any kind of area where we get significant change, massive change in a short period of time, it's tempting to look at a number of different things, isn't it? If we look at the dinosaurs disappearing, all sorts of theories around that. You know, maybe there was a huge meteorite that created a massive amount of debris and dust and so forth when it landed into the earth, and that created a sort of 2-year, 3-year winter during which the greenery necessary for herbivores to eat was no longer growing because of the lack of sun, and so the dinosaurs die out. Now, you know, I'm not going to debate that particular thing, but you can see what I'm talking about. This is like an event. We wouldn't nowadays call it a social event, but essentially the dinosaurs disappearing was an event that related to relationship between animal and earth. So I think we can pretty much assume that kind of physical event was not really the motivation behind the Renaissance or the Industrial Revolution or the Chinese innovation. So what else could it be? It could be something to do with something that goes on within human beings. I mean, humans became much more able to manufacture tools to make changes to their environment when we acquired the opposable thumb. I mean, it's something we don't think about on a day-to-day basis, but it's one of the things that means that we can use power tools, whereas, you know, our dog would have difficulty kind of doing that. So it's that kind of thing we can also look at. But it's a bit of a stretch to suggest that suddenly, you know, in, as it were, geological time, in a very short space of time, we've got a gene that suddenly sort of pops into place to generate creativity, and that gene suddenly disappears from our gene pool a couple of centuries later or something like that. So it's a little bit unlikely that's going to happen. What I'm going to suggest to you is that this is all about the social impact on creativity, and this is a very, very important point. As I've said before, for many, many years, the analysis and the research into creativity has often been on an individual basis. Let's take a bunch of creative people and see what it is they have in common, because that little bit might help us understand what creativity is. And that approach has not been very successful, to say the least. So what I think we can look at with more seriousness is the notion that societies can either motivate people to be creative or not. And I'm sure you can think of examples on a micro level in your own family, for instance. I have a very good friend who did not go to university immediately after school, not because she didn't want to, and she had certain skills, but was dissuaded from doing that because the class that she was brought up in England, that was not the expected activity. The expected activity was that you were going to learn shorthand and typing and work in an office, and that was that. Well, obviously the world has thankfully moved on a long way from there, but this is the sort of impact that social norms can have. And if you imagine a situation where social norms dissuade people from being creative, then you have the sort of circumstance where creativity is simply not going to occur so much. So you can imagine, I think, quite easily certain times, and I've worked in factories and manufacturing environments and so forth, where the last thing anybody wants you to do is to disturb the status quo, is to come up with smart ideas for changing things. No, that's not what we do here. We don't want to change things. We just want to turn the handle and the sausages come out the end of the machine and we all make money and I get to retire without having a headache. So, you know, this is the kind of thing that went on a lot. You know, we have always done it this way, not invented here. All sorts of phrases capture this notion. Now, if you turn the tables the other way around and you say, what about a society that really, really does support creativity? And you have a look at, once again, the Renaissance. And one of the things that characterizes the Renaissance was the fact that wealthy people, it was the kind of social norm in the wealthy upper classes that you sponsored people who were creative. And so you had the Michelangelos of this world, you had many composers that were sponsored by people who would basically, they take them in and they would give them food and boarding and money, and then they were expected to, for instance, create a musical masterpiece for an upcoming event. Perhaps it was just a dignitary visiting, perhaps it was a family wedding, all sorts of different things. So it was kind of the accepted practice, if you had money, to be ploughing some of that back into the culture, in the sense. And of course, this wasn't necessarily done because people wanted to generate a more creative culture. It was also a bit of one-upmanship in the sense, well, my composer is better than your composer, and look at all the painting on the ceiling of my house. It's so much more dramatic than the painting on the ceiling of your house. So, I'm sure there was a lot of that kind of thing going on as well. So what is very important here is to understand is that on the one hand, you have this notion that individual creativity does need plenty of space, plenty of room to breathe. And I think if you have a look at the lives of some of the great composers, and indeed sculptors and painters during the Renaissance, you will find that one of the things about having a wealthy person, wealthy family take you in, is that you then no longer have to be worrying about the rent, worrying about where the next meal's coming from, and that actually gives you your own personal space and freedom. And so that in itself is kind of interesting. But then the other thing is that you need this social context for creativity, in the sense that something like the Renaissance gave people the sense that it was okay to be creative. I know when I was a kid and I started to play the guitar in my early teens, and that guitar gradually went more kind of bluesy, and became electrified. And there were sort of people in my family who were perturbed in case I might want to become a musician, and we all know the old story about the musician. What's the difference between a pizza and a musician? Well, the pizza will feed a family of 4. So, it was definitely not a good thing to go into one of the creative professions when I was a kid. The fact that a couple of decades later, and you had what were then called pop musicians, the likes of Paul McCartney and many others who had amassed tens of millions of pounds. They were really the people who put music on the map as a way that you could take seriously the making of a livelihood. So anyway, that is another illustration really of the way in which people can mold your view of the creative professions. Okay, well, I apologize for the fact that this particular rambling has been a little lengthier than the others, but this is a very important area, I believe. As I've bored you with before, I'm a social psychologist, and one of the things that had a major impact on me really when I was doing my social psychology PhD was the fact that here, particularly in the West and particularly in the States, we take our individuality very, very seriously. We just conceptualize ourselves as being, unique individuals. We're every snowflake is different, and every individual person is also different. And of course, that's very true. One of the things that tends to mask, though, is the extent to which social norms guide our behaviors and our actions and our motivations. And that is to a major extent. And it's something we don't particularly like to admit, because it kind of makes us feel as if we're not very special, that we're highly disposable, and that our skills are not particularly unique or interesting. So we tend to gloss over that and really focus on the ways that we differ from others. But I think this discussion on creativity, for you to really take it on board, it depends upon you thinking very carefully about the extent to which our behaviours and what motivates us really are unique to us, or really are cultivated. They're a part of our socialization processes as we grow up. And I think that's one of the key things that impacts creativity. The other takeaway I'd just like to mention before we quit here is that part of this discussion relates to the fact that creativity is a wet bar of soap. I mean, we kind of think we've got creativity and then it disappears somehow. We find evidence that it's something slightly different, or we find that it's difficult to apply a particular idea that we've got about creativity. In other words, creativity is a very interesting field to study because it's very elusive. It's the only way to put it, really. We what is it that motivates us? Human beings are normally very lazy creatures. I mean, I don't want to use the word lazy in a derogatory way, but we really put a lot of effort in many aspects of our lives and our cognitive processes to minimize the energy that we have to put into living. And so for us to expend energy and indeed put ourselves at risk in nowadays, possibly in a different way than when we were cave people, because of curiosity, because of what ultimately comes down to creativity, it is an anomalous thing, and it really, I think, has been another factor that has masked the real processes that should be going on in the research of creativity. So anyway, it's a very new field, and that's one of the reasons I find it very exciting. Many different theories out there to explain the same kinds of behaviors. But I hope you've got some idea of the fact that, that it has these very interesting underpinnings. It's almost as if you can say, okay, well, creativity does this, and then suddenly you find an example where it does something very different. And we'll be talking about that too. Thank you.